So next step in the Magazine Abstractions project, once you have all your basic shapes and your basic composition laid out with pencil, the next step is to start laying some watercolor in there and matching some of the colors to your magazine to try to hide the magazine in there. So I'm going to start in a few different places and demo some different things. And then after that, show you some other interesting watercolor techniques that you could apply to this as well. So first things first, you want to get your setup right. Just a reminder of all that stuff I went over with you guys in our intro to watercolor, but you want to just make sure that you have a jar of water and a couple of brushes if you have access to a few different sizes. That's good. Your watercolor setup, I'm right-handed, so it's all on my right-hand side. And if your palette or the lid of your watercolors looks like this, mine are kind of a mess because I let my nieces use them all the time. So they're really kind of atrocious. But the best thing to start with is a clean palette because I don't want other colors that are left behind in there to mix in with my new colors that I'm trying to make, because that will affect the colors that I have. So just take the time. This is a damp piece of paper towel and I'm just wiping it clean so I have a nice clean slate to start with. And I'm working out of 2 watercolor palettes right now because I like to have a lot of room to mix. So first thing, I'm going to start with trying to match this color. It's like a teal blue-green sort of a color. So I'm going to mix it first in my palette and then apply it to the painting. Also, what I have here in my setup is just a little piece of watercolor scrap paper so that I can test my colors before I apply them to my painting. This is a really good habit. If you have your sketchbook, you could lay that near you and do the same thing. But before I actually put it on my painting, I can actually see that that color is a little too bright. It's got to be neutralized with just a touch of red. So try to remember back to all that stuff we learned about in school. I know it feels like it's ages away now. Actually, that did it pretty well. I just need a little bit more pigment in there because it looks too light. But testing it out on a piece of scrap paper is very helpful. And I would just get into that habit and always do that while doing this project. Okay, that looks good. Notice the form of my brush. It's rolled to a point for maximum control. Don't want your bristles to go everywhere. As I laid that down here, I noticed it has to be neutralized even more. So I just added a touch more red and mixed it up. You can always go back over and layer over dry watercolor as well. I think we got some practice with that before we left, but in case you're forgetting some of that stuff. What I'm going to attempt to do is just like in one of the practice things we did in our sketchbooks before we left, I'm going to make this fade from this color to a lighter value. So cleaning my brush, and now I'm just going to drag the existing color over. I'm gonna go right over these pencil lines and then I'll just enhance them later with colored pencil maybe. So making a faded effect is a really nice way to make sort of a basic area look more interesting. And I think I'm going to bring this pale color right over to the other magazine. Even though it doesn't match that magazine, I'm going to make these shapes match it. So that's just artistic license, however you want this to be composed. Not really sure what I'm going to do with these lines yet, but as you can see, because I'm just putting a nice light wash over them, you can still see them through it. So maybe I'll just hit those with colored pencil at a later time. I'll decide that later. I want to go back and make this match a little bit more. There we go. That's better. Clean brush, drag that darker color into the other color. If you're ever painting and it feels or it looks like the paper is kind of pilling up, like little bits of paper are coming up and it's pilling up, that means that you're overworking your paper and you should stop painting for the time being and continue later when the paper is completely dry. So now that I have this done for now, I'm gonna let that dry. And now I'm going to attempt to match the pink stripes that I see in this umbrella kind of a shape. I'm gonna extend that out. I mixed up like a purpley pink like I saw here, and I struggled a little bit to get the exact color. There are some colors that you can only get so close to with the colors that you have access to with a watercolor set, but just do the best you can, and you can always adjust later by layering colored pencil over it after. Now I have a good set of colored pencils, so I'm going to just try to get as close as I can with watercolor and then go back in and layer colored pencils over it, and the colors will mix that way. So this is the color I came up with. It's actually pretty close. It's not bad, but it's not an exact match. I just mixed a little bit of red and some purple. Now, like I said, my watercolor set is a bit atrocious. Not in really great condition, so there was, I think, something neutralizing my red a little bit too much. Somebody went in and mucked up my red, so it did affect the color here. But if I get like a pink colored pencil later, I can go in and adjust this color by simply shading right over it. So first I'll do my pink stripes. I have a smaller brush here to do this fine work. Now, if you don't have a tiny brush like this, if you're limited with brush sizes, one way you could deal with this area that has a lot of fine detail, like these really skinny stripes, is you could choose the lighter color. Like say I didn't have this small brush, I could choose the yellow to do first, and I could mix the proper yellow and then just put a light wash of the yellow over this whole area while letting the pencil line show through, much like I did here. Then after, when it was dry, I could go in and layer the darker color over it with colored pencil. So if you're limited in supplies, just try to be creative in ways that you can get the colors in there. And the reason why I said do yellow first is because it's the lighter color. So if you put yellow down first to match over the whole thing and then get the colored pencil and layer over the darker color over it, that'll work better than putting the darker color first and trying to layer a lighter color over it. So there are different ways you can do this. The other thing you want to keep in mind is, say I did all these purple stripes and then I was ready to do the yellow. If I did the yellow immediately without letting these colors dry, those colors would bleed together. I think that's something that, until you learn from experience, a lot of students don't realize until it actually happens. So just to save you some of that frustration, always let something dry before you go in with another color and go right up to it and right up next to it, because the two colors would bleed into each other. So then I'll continue with that. So kind of jumping around here, next I'm going to try to match some of this color and texture that's in this magazine clipping in some of these shapes. As you can see, I did one layer for the oranges. I think I'm going to go back in there and put some of those into shadow later, maybe even by shading with colored pencil. But for now, I'm going to try to match this green color and texture within these shapes. So I made this green by mixing black and yellow. I don't know if you remember back to when we were doing our color mixing in school. Black and yellow makes a really good olive green. And then I did add a touch of the green that I had in my watercolor here. There's all different shades going on in here, so I want to just try to get a blend of some different colors. Be as loose as I can with it in this little shape. Letting the different greens just kind of bleed into each other to try to get that texture. It's like painting camouflage. Yeah, these oranges really need to get more intense in some areas and darker in others. So I think I'm gonna hit those with a colored pencil after, just because they're kind of hard to reach in smaller areas. So you can see that the way I'm applying this watercolor is very different than the way I'm applying this watercolor and that watercolor. So depending on what kind of a thing you're trying to go for, whether it's smooth or just solid painting in a small shape or trying to get some sort of a texture, you're going to have to change it up depending on what it is you're trying to achieve, which is another reason why I love this project. It gets you to use all different types of techniques in one piece of artwork. You guys get the idea, so I'll continue on with that. Okay, so I spent a little more time developing just this little shape here to match it as best as I could. And what I did is, after I let that first layer of watercolor dry that you guys watched me do previously, I used a subtractive method for lifting up some areas of watercolor where you can see these lighter leafy shapes here. And what I did was I put some water on my brush, applied it to the dry surface of the watercolor that had already dried, and then dabbed up some of the color, removed some of the color to get some of those lighter highlighted leafy shapes in there. Towards the end of this video, I demonstrate exactly how to work subtractively with watercolors, so keep watching. And then I layered some colored pencil into the oranges to brighten them up a little, add a shadow side and a lighter side, just mimicking what I saw in these areas in this one piece, and I'm pretty proud of it. I think it matches very well. In the end, if you need to kind of touch your project to see what's magazine and what's actually hand painted and hand done, that's kind of what we're going for, is to get it to match so well that the magazine just is hidden right in there with the rest of the painting. If you want to work, I kind of like to work back and forth, watercolor, colored pencil, watercolor, colored pencil. You can do that. If you prefer to do all your watercolor at once and then wait until I give more pointers on the colored pencil step, you could do that in a whole separate round if you'd like to. So like kind of get all your watercolor squared away, apply washes to all of your shapes, and then after, in the next sort of finishing touch phase, then go in and add colored pencil. I like to see things develop as I go along, so I'm kind of working back and forth between the two. So that's up to you and what you like for your own process. And you probably won't know that until you begin. I want to show you guys some other fun techniques that you could use with watercolor for your magazine abstraction. So you don't have to choose to just color or paint in your shapes and drawings with just flat even watercolor. You could try some different effects in there. Try to remember back to when we were back at school and we did some different color fade techniques, fading one color to another, or fading one color from light to dark. We did a color bleed thing where we let the droplets of paint bleed into the water. So all of those things are techniques that you can use in the final painting that you make for the magazine abstraction. But these are two other things that you could use. They're fun and they require just some household things that you probably do have access to. So one is plastic wrap. So I just have a little square of plastic wrap handy before I get started so I can work fast. And two is salt. And I just took the salt from my kitchen that I have that I put in my food. I just put it in a little bowl so it'd be easier to sprinkle it. So I'll show you both these techniques. Both of these techniques require a good amount of water and a good amount of paint. So you want to apply those things liberally to the paper. And when I say liberally, I mean apply a lot of it. So I'll do this with blue color. Put it on the paper, add lots of water. You can even do multicolors. Bring some green in there. You can mix the color first in your palette, or if you want to go for more of a freestyle random effect, surprise effect, you could just do what I'm doing here. So lots of water, it's kind of pooled up, probably more so than you would typically use if you were just trying to paint in a shape in a very neat way. And then get my plastic wrap, put it over the painted area, crinkle it a little, and then press it down. And then you have to let it dry. So you have to keep it on there and do not remove it until it's completely dry. So probably like, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes or so. Watercolor dries really fast. You can remove it and it should look something like this. Every time you do it, it will look different. So you will not have control. If you're one of those types of people who wants to have control over what it looks like, then this is not the option for you, but it is a really interesting effect that you can't get otherwise. It almost looks like an icy texture. So if you have any bits of magazine in your piece that have an icy texture, this might be a really good way to camouflage the magazine in your painting by doing this. And then the second way is salt. Both of these work really well, especially the salt one with darker colors. The saran wrap, I feel like you could do it with any color, but particularly with the salt one, if you use darker colors, it doesn't work so well with pale yellows. Even orange is a little bit light for this effect to actually show up. Okay, so again, lots of color, lots of pigment, lots of water, and then the key is to take some salt and just sprinkle it over the surface. So you don't really want to dump it because you won't have control, it'll just clump up on there, but sprinkle it. And what is going to happen is the salt is going to absorb the water where it hits the watercolor. Just a little bit is all you need. And where it absorbs that water, it soaks up the pigment as well. And it leaves, oops, sorry for the shaking, it leaves little lighter speckles. So here's one that dried over time. It's a really interesting kind of sandy texture to it. And in the areas where it's lighter, the salt has absorbed up the water and the color a little bit so that it has a speckled effect. Again, with this, you have to let it dry. You won't see the results right away. So I guess after about like a 10 to 15 minute time, I mean, you don't want the paper to be too damp when you do this, but once it feels completely dry, if you just touch it lightly to make sure it's dry, you can brush the salt off and it should have an interesting speckled effect like this. Here's a green one too. These are ones that I did in the past. And again, you can do this with multicolors if you'd like. So try out some different things. I would try these things on a piece of scrap paper before actually applying them to your final to make sure that you like the way it looks. Another technique I want to show you all today is what's called a subtractive technique, or working subtractively with watercolor. I think a lot of people don't know that you can actually work this way with watercolor. Like once it's down, you can only apply other layers over it, but you actually can work into watercolor subtractively, and I will demonstrate what that means in a minute. What you need to start with first is a layer of watercolor that's dry to the touch. So this has been applied earlier. It's completely dry. A lot like the salt technique that I just showed. This technique works best with darker colors because you'll see once I do this, you sort of need the contrast of light and dark for it to really take its effect. So I have a little piece of scrap paper towel here that I'm going to use to do this. Get a brush and just some clean water. I've got water on my brush and I'm going to lay down some water over the dry watercolor. And I'm using circular motions to kind of dig into that watercolor. And then I get a little piece of scrap paper towel and dab at the area that I just applied water to. And as you can see, it removes or subtracts some of the watercolor. So if you have a texture that has light and dark values in it that you're trying to emulate, and it's hard because you've already put down, say, a dark tone, you can always go in and work subtractively. Let's do another one for you so you can see it again. A little bit of water, piece of paper towel, dab away at it. This effect will vary depending on what types of paper you have. With watercolor paper, it works amazing. So if you're not working on watercolor paper, I would just, like I said in the last demo, just get a piece of scrap of the same kind of paper that you're using for your final painting and try it out to see how the paper handles it. This is another example that I made in the past at school. This is a piece of magazine here on the left of grass, right? A grassy texture. And this area on the right, I laid down pretty much the same color, a dark green, right next to it, just all solid, let it dry, and then I use my brush like you just watched me do with those little circles to pull out like more linear kind of grassy textures. Then what I did after, once everything was dry, in the areas where I felt like the color needed to be adjusted a little, maybe it needed to be warmed up a little bit, I actually got colored pencil and I shaded some yellow and some yellow green into those areas that I had subtracted before. Everything was dry when I did that. So that's another way to create some interesting textures in your watercolor while we're in the watercolor phase.